Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of the Post with BP. I'm your host, Billy Parvatam. Folks, I'm so excited today to be joined by a legend, Mr. Don Fischer, the longtime voice of the Indiana Hoosiers since 1973. He's been there nearly 50 years, and it's such a pleasure to get to talk to him today. Mr. Fischer, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Billy.
Well, I want to start off with first, you've been covering Indiana for nearly 50 years. You've seen so many things happen on the court, but can you ever imagine that you would experience a year like you did this year with COVID? I'm sure it affected you both personally and professionally. How do you describe this unique year in your broadcasting career?
Well, I can describe it in one word: surreal. Never have I done a season without fans. Even in earlier jobs when we didn't have many people at high school games and things like that, we still always had some fans around cheering their team. But this year, that was obviously didn't happen very often. Toward the end of the season, we got some fans a little bit. Selected number were allowed into some ball games, especially the Big Ten tournament. But during the season, no fans. The only time we experienced fans during the football season was in the Outback Bowl, which Indiana was able to get into this year. It was just, the atmosphere was dead. It felt like you were literally at a scrimmage for so many of the games. And when we got to the bowl game, the Outback Bowl game, they allowed, I think Indiana had something like 8,000 fans there. And it sounded like a million fans to me because it was so different just to have fans in the stands cheering their team, that kind of thing. It was so much more fun to be a part of it. So from my perspective, and of course, many of the games we did this year were done in a studio. We weren't allowed to go on the road except for games we could travel to day of game. So we had 3 games in basketball that we did day of game until we got to the Big Ten tournament. And then we were allowed to do the Big Ten tournament, which our team lasted just 1 game. So it wasn't a long Big Ten tournament stay, but it was just different. It was such, it has a different feel to it. It's nowhere near as much fun to be a part of it. At the same time, I love doing play-by-play, so I enjoyed that part of it. But the atmosphere and everything was just so different. And honestly, I don't want to have to go through a season like that again.
Let's go back to more happier times. You first came to Indiana in 1973, 48 years ago. How did this opportunity open up?
Well, I had been in Terre Haute, Indiana for 2.5 years back in 1971 or 1971 through or 70 through 72. At the end of the football season in 72, the radio station had been sold in the summertime, and the FM side was going to become a music-intensive format. Therefore, sports was no longer going to be on the FM side, and I was averaging 175 play-by-plays a year. And I know that sounds like pretty dramatic number of games, but that's exactly what we were doing. We were doing everything from, we actually did the city golf tournament on the 18th hole for the last 2 hours of the tournament down there in Terre Haute. It was so much fun. But I was doing so many games and that kind of thing, and I did not want to stop doing games at the end of football. So I started looking for more work, and I ended up going back to a radio station where I started my sportscasting career in Ottawa, Illinois, because they had a high school kid during their games. The program director, when I was there initially, had become the general manager of the station. And I called him up one day and I said, look, they're not going to do any more basketball or anything at Terre Haute. I said, as soon as football ends, and I said, I don't want to just go through a winter and not have any play-by-play to do. Do you have anything, or do you know anybody that might be available? He said, we got a high school kid during our games. He said, you come up and tutor our high school kid and help him become a better play-by-play guy. And he said, you could sell for me. And I know you'll be leaving at the end of the year or at the end of basketball season, because that's when jobs start opening up. And I said, that's exactly right. So he allowed me to come up there. So I went back to Ottawa, Illinois. And so in April of 73, I started hunting jobs, and I literally was in the running for several different jobs. I was offered a job on the spot at WJBC in Bloomington, Illinois, to do Illinois State, which would have been a good gig. It would have been kind of a parallel move from the Terre Haute position that I had previously. Sounded like a good job. I went and interviewed for the job. The guy wanted to hire me on the spot. which was unique to me. I always had to go through all these ramifications with interviews and things like that, and then wait for 2 weeks to see if I had any chance and that kind of thing. But long story short, I had already found out about a job in Eugene, Oregon that had been one that I would have taken in a heartbeat. And I just gotten a call from my boss. Literally the day I went down for this interview, I got a call from my former boss in Terre Haute, a guy named Harvey Glore. And he said, have you applied for the IU job? And I said, what IU job? He goes, Indiana University, play-by-play. I said, I didn't know the job was open. He goes, well, he says, they've been open. It's been open for about a month and a half. He says it's been listed in Broadcast Magazine. I took Broadcast Magazine and never saw the ad. So I said it must have been a closed box or something like that, but whatever the case. I said, well, do you know anybody in Indianapolis? He says, I know the general manager. I don't know him well, but he says, I'll call, just find out if they've whittled it down to 4 or 5 people or whatever the case may be. So he called the general manager up, and the general manager said, well, we've had 270 some applicants for this job. He said, what's one more? So they allowed me to send my tape and my resume. And I was probably the last guy that applied for that position. And so at any rate, I told the guy in Bloomington that wanted to hire me on the spot. I said, look, if one of these 2 jobs come open, I said, and they're telling me that I'm the guy that they want, I would hate to take your job and 3 weeks from now say, I'm going to take this other job. So I said, I just couldn't do that to you, number one. Number two, it wouldn't be fair to anybody in this situation. And he said, I understand. He says, if you haven't got the job in 30 days, will you take this job? I said, yeah, I better take a bird in the hand worth 10 in the bush, right? So at any rate, I said, yes, sir, I would take it. Well, I literally got back home. 2 days later, I got an interview with the radio station in Indianapolis that had the broadcast rights for IU. It was WIRE. And I went down for the interviewed for it. A week later, they called me back and they said, we want you. I said, unbelievable. So I called the guy up in Bloomington, Illinois, and I said, sir, I really appreciate the fact that you were going to hold this job for me, but I got the job in Indianapolis. He said, great, good luck, that kind of thing. And he said, do you know anybody that's a good play-by-play guy? And I said, yeah, I know a guy 15 miles from Ottawa named Art Kimball, who was the guy that got me started in sportscasting. He was a guy that gave me all kinds of prep information and stuff. And I said, this guy is really a great play-by-play guy. I can't believe you don't know who he was, because Bloomington, Illinois is just like 60 miles from LaSalle, Peru. He did not know who Art Kimball was, but Art Kimball got that job. And so I helped somebody that helped me. And so I really felt good about myself. So as you know, this business is you being at the right spot at the right time and that kind of thing, and kind of who you know, and giving yourself a chance to get your foot in the door. And that's pretty much what happened for me.
And the rest is history, as they say. And you've covered 3 national championships during your time at Indiana, 1976, 1981, and 1987. I'm curious, which championship stands out to you the most?
Well, they all 3 were special. There's no question about that. But the first one is always the one that sticks out to me for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was the first one I had a chance to be a part of. Number two, that team was 32-0, and it's still the last unbeaten team in college basketball, even after this year. And Gonzaga looked like they were going to get it done, but they did not. And Indiana, of course, that season was a phenomenal year. 32-0 season. The year before, they were 31-1, and Coach Knight always said that team in 1975 was the best team that he ever coached, even though the 76 team went 32-0 and won the national championship. But Scott May was hurt as a junior that year in the Purdue ball game late in the season, and even though he tried to come back, Indiana got beat in the game that he tried to come back in against Kentucky in the Mideast Regional over in Dayton, Ohio. And Indiana got beat, I think, 93-91 or 93-92, something like that, in that game with Kentucky that year, who's an arch rival, incidentally. So that didn't go well. But all that said, the 32-0 team was just a special group of kids. And they had that goal from the very beginning to win a national championship. It wasn't about wins and losses. It was about winning a national title. And you could just tell the way they went about their business all year long. It was business. And of course, Coach Knight made it a point for it to be business for these guys, but they also had a great time in doing it. And without question, they were good enough to get it done. And it was just a fun year. And that championship game was very emotional for a lot of people, and including myself. It was emotional from the standpoint of I'm doing a national championship game. I'm doing something that I've always dreamed about doing, and it's my first opportunity to do it. Maybe my last opportunity. You just didn't know at that point in time in your career. I had never intended, or I never really thought about how long I would be doing Indiana basketball at that time. And that was just my third season. So, to last 3 years into that and think that I got a national championship under my belt, it was a great feeling.
And how do you describe working with one of the most legendary coaches in history of college basketball, Bob Knight? I mean, certainly a personality both on and off the court. You worked with him for nearly 30 years. I mean, how do you just describe that relationship that you had with him?
Well, I think it was a very professional relationship. As you know, or maybe you don't, but Bob Knight was a little cantankerous with media people. And you can go back through the years that he was the head coach and find all kinds of controversial things that happened with the media while he was the head coach. So I would classify it, because I lived in Indianapolis. I worked for this Indianapolis radio station, WIRE, and they had the broadcast rights, which is 50 miles from where I live to Bloomington. And so I wasn't down to a lot of practices in those days, in the early part of the years that I worked there and things like that. I just didn't have the time, because I was the sports director at the radio station, and we had the Indiana Pacers and summer baseball with the Indianapolis Indians and those kinds of things to cover, as well as the stuff that we were doing from a high school perspective. We weren't doing a ton of it, but we were doing some. At any rate, so I didn't get to go down there as much in those days, but Coach Knight was a guy that if you gained his respect, that you were in. Now, it didn't mean that he always treated you perfectly, because that was not the case, because he could get on your case pretty quickly. And if you ask him a dumb question, you get told it was a dumb question, those kinds of things, in his mind anyway. But, and it could have been, and he would do things that were he was ornery. I can tell you that. And he loved to keep you on your toes. And, but at the same time, he was one of the most brilliant coaches he's the most brilliant coach I've ever been around, without question. He had a tremendous ability to make kids better. He developed players. And if you ever talk to anybody about Coach Knight's teams, they always got better as the season went along. And that was a special quality there in itself. But Bob Knight, to me, is the greatest college basketball coach that's ever lived, just because of the kind of talent that he had. And we had some really good teams, but we had teams that were not as talented as a lot of other people's. I mean, the 87 championship, there are a lot of teams in that year that everybody thought were going to win the national title, and Indiana was not one of them. But that team got hot at the end, and they had some great play from Steve Alford and Keith Smart, and guys like that, who were just terrific basketball players, but they weren't the most talented guys in the world. And Bob Knight knew how to put these teams together. And so that team was very special in itself. But Coach Knight was, like I said, the best college basketball coach I've ever seen. And I've never seen anybody close to him since.
What's the best Isiah Thomas story you have? Obviously, one of the greatest point guards in NBA history, 50 greatest players of all time. And of course, he was the leader of that 1981 championship team.
Well, I will tell you this, that Isiah Thomas is one of the toughest competitors I've ever been around. And I can tell you how competitive he is. That'll be the best story I can tell you about Isiah, because Indiana and Purdue, as you probably know, are huge rivals in this state. And without question, every time they got together, there was always something that could happen. And Isiah, I believe this was his sophomore year, because he only played 2 years at IU. I think it was his sophomore season. Purdue was playing Indiana in Bloomington that day, and a guy named Roosevelt Barnes for Purdue and Isiah got into a little trash talking with one another back and forth. And I don't know what precipitated this, but at one point during the ball game, Isiah slapped Roosevelt Barnes right in the face. And I don't know that anybody saw it. that anybody really saw what happened, because all of a sudden everything stopped. And the officials, I don't know if the officials even saw it. I can't remember if there was a foul called. All I know is they got in between the two of them, and that was the end of it. But then we later found out that Isiah had slapped him right in the face. Now, whether that was in response to something that Roosevelt Barnes did or not, I can't answer that question. But it kind of showed you the competitiveness and the toughness that Isiah Thomas evoked, because he was one of those guys that he gave you that baby face smile, but you never trusted that baby face smile, especially if you were an opponent.
And I'll pair these two guys together because they were both on the 87 team. But what do you remember about Steve Alford and Keith Smart? Of course, Steve Alford, Indiana guy through and through, and Smart hit the game winner in the championship game against Syracuse.
Well, the best thing that happened to that team in 87 was that Keith Smart and Garrett, the center, those two kids came to school, D. Garrett. And those two kids were spectacular junior college players. And we thought, well, they'll be okay as guys at IU, but how good they'll be, we don't know. Well, they both turned out to be terrific players, and they were special in that sense. And Smart was just such a talented kid and very athletic, and he needed to learn how to play in Indiana style and those kinds of things, but he adapted very quickly, and he had a really great season. But he was critical to that basketball team. And without question, in the championship game, he was the leading scorer in that championship ball game. I think he had 22 points in that contest. And of course, he hit the shot that was a shock around the world, because if you looked at that shot and how he took it, he was driving toward the baseline and just kind of pulled up and shot the ball, and it was kind of sliding off to his left. And normally those shots don't go in, but he buried about a 16-foot baseline jump shot that turned out to be the game winner with 6 seconds to go. But nobody called timeout right away. And in those days, I think the only person who could call timeout was a coach. I think that was the rule at that time. And I don't know if Boeheim fell asleep, or we were even surprised that they allowed a timeout to be taken, because nobody was moving on the floor. It was basically, so somebody called timeout with like a second or two to go, and Knight, of course, questioned the official, like, all right, who called that timeout? Because he didn't think Boeheim had called it. He thought a player had. So at any rate, but the officials gave the timeout to Syracuse, and so they literally had to play an inbound pass. They had a second left on the clock. And of course, Keith Smart intercepted the pass on the inbound, threw the ball up in the air. It was a great finish to that season, no question. But Keith Smart and Dean Garrett were two critical components to that basketball team, because the year before, after losing their big guy inside, it was going to be a struggle. And those two guys came on. And of course, Garrett was a big, big factor for the ball club, as was Smart.
What do you remember about Victor Oladipo? He's a more recent star, and of course, having a successful career in the NBA currently.
Well, Vic was a terrific player. And before you go any further, I need to say something about Steve Alford. Steve Alford is the best pure shooter that I've seen at Indiana since I've been there. He could knock down shots from anywhere on the floor. He could knock down threes. He was a great mid-range shooter. He could score inside. He wasn't the quickest. He wasn't the fastest. He wasn't the most athletic player that Indiana's ever had by any stretch of the imagination. And Bob Knight said he never played a lick of defense in his career, which was untrue. But honestly, Steve Alford was unbelievable as a shooter. He was really a smart player. Obviously, he became a coach because that's who his dad was, a coach, and he grew up in that coaching family. And he's become a really good basketball coach on top of everything else. But as a player, the best pure shooter I've ever seen at Indiana.
And, you know, I wanted to ask you, too, about football, because oftentimes I feel like people ask you a lot about basketball. But, you know, you had a chance to cover Antwaan Randle, a guy who ended up winning a Super Bowl with the Steelers. What do you remember about Antwaan during his time with the Hoosiers?
I remember he was what's the cartoon character that spins all the time? I can't think of it. I can't think of whoever it is, but he is a whirling dervish. This kid was unbelievable as a quarterback. And the most amazing thing about him, he played every single game in 4 years that he played at Indiana, and went out with an injury one time. It was in his freshman year. against Michigan State late in the game with about, I'd say about 3 minutes to go in the final quarter of play. And that game went into overtime, but he was not available. I think he got dinged and had to come out. I don't know if it was a concussion or not. Back in those days, if you went out with any kind of a head injury, they just kept you on the sideline if they thought you had a concussion. If they shined the light in your eyes and your eyes didn't go like that, they probably put you back out in the field whether you had a concussion or not. And I know it's nothing to laugh at in the sense of that it is serious stuff these days, but at the same time in those days, they played it totally different. And but Antwaan was one of the smartest football players I've ever seen, one of the best athletes that's ever played the game of football. Never came off the field. Like I said, he came off the field one time. And of course, the biggest mistake ever made with him, not that it was a mistake for his career, but the biggest mistake that Indiana made with him was Cam Cameron decided in his senior year that he had a couple of quarterbacks on the sideline. He thought he could take advantage of Antwaan as a wide receiver. And he started him as a wide receiver in the opening game against North Carolina State that year. Phillip Rivers was the quarterback of North Carolina State, and they kicked Indiana's butt. And it was primarily because the quarterbacks that Cam was so high on going into the season didn't get the job done, and Antwaan was not utilized properly. I mean, he should have been the quarterback, and when Indiana would have had a chance in that game maybe to win it. And you know that in 4 years' time, Antoine Randall, as good as he was, and he was absolutely fabulous, pound for pound, absolutely the best football player in my 48 years of covering Indiana football, that his teams never had a winning season in those 4 seasons. And they were 5-6 in his last year. It was a shame.
And going off of that point, Mr. Fisher, has it been tough to cover Indiana football? I mean, they have not had the success that the basketball program has had. I mean, has that been tough for you over the years at times when, it kind of seems like there's been stretches the team hasn't been great to cover the team?
Well, if you're asking me if it's tough from the standpoint of winning and losing, sure. We've had a lot of losing at Indiana University over the years in football. We currently are on a high because we've had 2 teams in a row that have been pretty doggone good to 2 bowl games, and should have beat Tennessee a couple of years ago in Jacksonville in the Gator Bowl. And then this past year we get beat by Ole Miss in the Outback Bowl. But both those teams were really good, 8-4, 6-2. Those are the teams' records going into those bowl games. And honestly, they could have very easily won both those bowl games, despite the fact that Ole Miss outplayed Indiana in the Outback Bowl this last time out. But that said, sure, it's never as much fun calling losing football, but I'm still calling football. And it's play-by-play. That's what I got into the business to do. That's what I've always wanted to do. And basically, that's all I do now. This is a football and a basketball play-by-play for IU. And I also do the coaches' talk shows. But outside of that, I don't have to do any sports shows of any kind. I do some interviews with other radio stations, those kinds of things. But I'm doing exactly what I want to do these days.
And speaking of the coaches, so what are your expectations for Mike Woodson, the new Indiana coach? I mean, he played for Coach Knight, so you obviously have a familiarity level with him. He was an NBA coach for a long time. So what's your expectations for him? How excited are you for him to come back to his alma mater?
Well, it's really exciting to have an Indiana guy back as the head basketball coach, somebody that knows the culture of Indiana basketball, even though he's been gone ever since he graduated. He graduated in 1980, and obviously he played in the NBA for 11 seasons, and then he became a coach. And he's had a really good run as a head coach and as an assistant coach in the NBA. And he comes from the New York Knicks. So he's got that pedigree that kids these days are all looking at. They all want to get to the NBA. That's what they all think until they get to the college level, and they get disappointed in the roles that they're playing sometimes. And now, of course, the transfer portal allows you to go someplace else if you don't like it here, that kind of thing. But that said, Mike Woodson's going to be a terrific coach in Indiana, in my opinion. I think there's nobody that you can talk to that says he doesn't know the X's and the O's. He certainly knows that. He's got a great ability to relate to players, which has already been noticeable here at Indiana because we had 6 guys go in the portal. When they found out that Archie Miller was going to leave or was let go. And 4 of those guys came back. And that's all because of Mike Woodson sitting down with these guys and talking to them. And the one guy that left, Al Durham, had finished 4 years of basketball at Indiana, and he just wanted to change of scenery because he wasn't going to play a 5th year at IU, and he wasn't going to make it in the NBA, and he'd have to go to Europe or something like that. And I think he thought he could raise his stock if he played someplace else for a year. So that's why he went to Providence. But Armaan Franklin, they lost him to Virginia, but everybody else came back, which is a really good thing. Trace Jackson Davis, who could have gone to the NBA, decided, I'm not ready yet because I don't shoot well with my right hand. I don't dribble well. I don't play very good defense. Well, I'm telling you this as him talking, but he probably wouldn't tell you all those things. But he has all those things to get better at. And he's already an All-American. So the kid's really a good player, but he's got a lot of work to do, and he's got to develop an outside shot because that's the one thing he's not had in the 2 years he's played at IU. So he got that kid to buy in immediately. So Woodson has definitely got a way with players, a way to get these kids understanding their roles, what it's going to be like, those kinds of things. And I don't think there's any question. And here's the other thing that he's done. He has drawn back all those Indiana fans or former players who have been so disenfranchised, so to speak, and most of it's on their own behalf. I mean, most of these people have made their own decisions not to support the program as strongly as they used to because they have been unhappy with somebody that wasn't an Indiana guy. Well, they got an Indiana guy now, and I think Mike Woodson's absolutely the right guy to take over. And he's already hired Dane Fife as an assistant coach, which is a great hire because Dane's been in the Big Ten for the last 10 years. He's going to give Mike a lot of insights into a lot of things that went on here in the Big Ten and the way things are done with other teams. So it's a great, great fit.
Mr. Fischer, you've been so gracious with your time. I have 2 final questions for you. My first one is, what's your advice to aspiring sportscasters trying to make it in this business? I mean, you know better than anyone, it's already a competitive business, and recently this last year we've had to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. So what's your advice to young guys and girls like me who want to make it in this field of sportscasting?
Well, I guess having not interviewed for a job in 48 years, I'm not sure I can give you a really good answer to that question because, like I said, I've been here for a long, long time. But the most important thing about any job that you get, it doesn't matter what kind of profession you're talking about, you've got to be prepared. And if you can prepare yourself for whatever you're trying to do from a sportscasting perspective, and that means you've got to go out and do play-by-play, whether that's taking a tape recorder with you and sitting up at the top row of the stands at a high school basketball game and doing the broadcast and then listening back to it, hearing what you sound like, hearing the things, phraseologies that you're using and the verbs and all the things. You just try to develop your skills as a play-by-play man. You also have to be prepared to do those games, which means you've got to study both teams that you're doing. You've got to get ready with stat sheets and all those kinds of things. And at the college level, you can get ready to do those kinds of things because you have so much information available to you. At the high school level, that's a lot of work these days, because high schools don't go into the detail of statistics and those kinds of things in most places, I should say, that you need or can help you sound like you really know what you're talking about. So preparation is the key. That's the most important thing that you can do as a play-by-play guy, is to get ready to do the job you're going to do. Whether that's an interview, you get background information, whether that's play-by-play of 2 teams that you don't know. You've got to get ready to do the game, and therefore you've got to study those 2 teams, and you've got to call somebody that can give you information. That's a sports information director if it's college. It's probably the athletic director at the high school you're going to go to, or has a team that you're going to be involved with, and have him point somebody out that can feed you information about that team, and read all the newspapers you can get your hands on in regarding to those teams. So there's so much involved to it. It's not that hard, but it is involved, and it takes time, and you can't be impatient. I started out in small town radio stations. Town that I was in the first time my first job was in Butte, Montana, and I was just a disc jockey. I wasn't even doing play-by-play. I literally got a job doing a nighttime shift from 9 at night till 6 o'clock in the morning. And my 9 o'clock till midnights was playing music on the radio as a disc jockey. My 12 to 3 shift was as a janitor. And in my 3 to 6 shift was doing the farm news on this radio station. So it gave me great background though, and I was doing it at a time where there weren't as many listeners in most cases. And the great thing about it was I could make mistakes and not get fired because everybody makes mistakes. And if you're a big time radio station and you're making a lot of mistakes, you're out the door. So I started in small town radio. And I think that's the great place to start if you're interested in radio. Everybody wants to go into TV these days, but some of us have faces made for radio. And that's why I've been successful in it, because nobody has to look at this. So when you think about it, it kind of depends on what you want to do, but the preparation is the most important thing. And almost every school these days, every Division I school for the most part, has a telecommunications department and courses in those areas. And you almost always have a small radio station, either a student station or something that you can get involved with. That's how you get started. And then start in small town radio where you can make some mistakes and listen to the game that you do. If you want to be play-by-play or be a play-by-play guy, you have to listen to yourself and be very self-critical of yourself. If you're not going to learn anything. If you think you're as good as you're going to get right now, the first time you do a game, you've got no chance in this business unless you're the ultimate in talent. So you've got to have the preparation. You've got to do play-by-play. It takes some time. I mean, I was dramatically better from the first game that I did to the last game I did the first year. I just got so much better because I was doing more games and I was starting to get a feel for it, and I was starting to get comfortable. So it boils down to basically preparation. So whatever you're looking for in this business, you can do it if you prepare.
My final question for you, Mr. Fischer, again, you've been so gracious with your time, is as you reflect on your career, are you pretty content with how it's played out? I mean, like I mentioned, you've been at Indiana for nearly 50 years. You've covered some of the great people in all of collegiate sports, like Coach Knight, like Isiah Thomas. You've seen so many great memories, like 3 national championships. I mean, as you reflect on your career, are you pretty happy with how it's played out? Is there something you wish you could have done, maybe an event you could have called, or all being said, pretty happy to have been at Indiana the last almost 50 years?
Well, like anybody else in this business, early on in my career, I thought, well, Indiana will be a stop. I might be there for 5 or 6 years, maybe 10 at the most. And I thought I would move on and maybe I could become an NBA guy. I could become a Major League Baseball guy. The Major League Baseball thing I found out very quickly was not going to happen, primarily because if you're not doing baseball, number one, then you're not really ready to do baseball. And Marty Brenneman and Joe Nuxall back in the day, back in the 70s, were two of the best in the business. And they allowed me to come up and do an Indianapolis Indians game against the Cincinnati Reds, an exhibition game with them. I got to do like 3 innings with them. And I found out very quickly that I wasn't ready for that, nor was I prepared well enough for it, even though I'd done some baseball games at the high school and the college level and things like that. But it wasn't Major League Baseball. And it wasn't that. I mean, I found out very quickly, I probably would have gotten there, but I would have had to go to the minor leagues for a while or someplace to do a consistent amount of baseball. And I just never had that. So I wasn't as prepared as I needed to be. And I found out guys that are doing Major League Baseball, most of these guys started out probably doing minor league baseball and worked their way up the ladder, some of them very quickly and others not so quick. But that said, you find out very quickly that that's not the key. Then the other opportunities I've had, I had a couple of chances to go to the Minnesota Vikings. I had a chance to go to the Cleveland Cavaliers, and I had an opportunity to become the voice of the Indiana Pacers back in 1987, I believe it was. And I just couldn't pull the trigger on them. I was really enjoying myself in Indiana. I knew I had a niche, I'd found my niche, so to speak. And I was starting to make a little bit of money because, as you know, if you know anything about radio, you know that you're not going to make a lot of money, not at least at the outset. So at any rate, I was starting to make a little bit of money and things got better for my family and everything from that standpoint. And I knew from a family perspective, I had remarried. I had custody of my kids. And we had only been in our marriage for about a year when I got this offer from the Pacers. And if I took that job, I would have been putting my new wife in possession of 3 young boys who probably needed me to be around a lot more than I would have been. And I decided that the best thing for my family was to not take the position. So I did not take it. And I lost out on a lot of money because I could have made a big upgrade in my salary and everything else. But when I look back at it, I made the right choices in almost every situation in that regard.
Mr. Fischer, this has been such a great pleasure talking to you. I mean, you're a legend in this business. All the great stories and insights you have about your career. Thank you so much for your time. This has really been a treat for me today.
Nice talking to you, Billy.
That's Mr. Don Fischer, the longtime voice of the Indiana Hoosiers since 1973. He's been so nice to join me on the latest edition of The Pulse with BP. Thanks so much to everybody for joining us. We'll see you next time.